Hello everyone, today we read the third paragraph of the first chapter of the first book of von Clausewitz's Vom Krige, the one on the utmost use of force, which is a dramatically important paragraph, not just for von Clausewitz's theory, but also for, interestingly enough, for the contents and the considerations about war and the use of violence. It's relatively long, so today we will not read it in German, but it's nevertheless very important and always mandatory, I would say, for anyone who wants to learn the Vom Krige to read it from the original language. Nevertheless, here we go. So, utmost use of force. Now, philanthropists may easily imagine there is a skillful method of disarming and overcoming an enemy without great bloodshed, and that this is the proper tendency of the art of war. However plausible this may appear, still it is an error which must be extirpated. For in such dangerous things as war, the errors which proceed from a spirit of benevolence are the worst. As the use of physical power to the utmost extent by no means excludes the cooperation of the intelligence, it follows that he who uses force unsparingly, without a reference to the bloodshed involved, must obtain a superiority if his adversary uses less vigor in its application. The former then dictates the law to the latter, and both proceed to extremities to which the only limitations are those imposed by the amount of counteracting force on each side. This is the way in which the matter must be viewed, and it is to no purpose, it is even against one's own interest, to turn away from the consideration of the real nature of the affair, because the horror of its elements excites repugnance. If the wars of civilized people are less cruel and destructive than those of savages, the difference arises from the social condition both of states in themselves and in their relations to each other. Out of this social condition and its relation war arises, and by it war is subjected to conditions, is controlled and modified. But these things do not belong to war itself, they are only given conditions, and to introduce into the philosophy of war itself a principle of moderation would be an absurdity. Two motives lead men to war: instinctive hostility and hostile intention. In our definition of war, we have chosen as its characteristic the latter of these elements, because it is the most general. It is impossible to conceive the passion of hatred of the wildest description, bordering on mere instinct, without combining with the idea of a hostile intention. On the other hand, hostile intentions may often exist without being accompanied by any, or at all events by an extreme, hostility of feeling. Amongst savages, views emanating from the feelings; amongst civilized nations, those emanating from the understanding have the predominance. But this difference arises from attendant circumstances, existing institutions, etc., and therefore it is not to be found necessarily in all cases, although it prevails in the majority. In short, even the most civilized nations may burn with passionate hatred of each other. We may see from this what a fallacy it would be to refer the war of a civilized nation entirely to an intelligent act on the part of the government, and to imagine it as a continually freeing itself more and more from all feeling of passion in such a way that at last the physical masses of combatants would no longer be required. In reality, their mere relations would suffice, a kind of algebraic action. Theory was beginning to drift in this direction until the facts of the last war taught it better. If war is an act of force, it belongs necessarily also to the feelings. If it does not originate in the feelings, it reacts more or less upon them, and the extent of this reaction depends not on the degree of civilization, but upon the importance and duration of the interests involved. Therefore, if we find civilized nations do not put their prisoners to death, do not devastate towns and countries, this is because their intelligence exercises greater influence on their mode of carrying on war, and has taught them more effectual means of applying force than these rude acts of mere instinct. The invention of gunpowder, the constant progress of improvements in the construction of firearms, are sufficient proofs that the tendency to destroy the adversary which lies at the bottom of the conception of war is no way changed or modified through the progress of civilization. We therefore repeat our proposition that war is an act of violence pushed to its utmost bounds, as one side dictates the law to the other. Then there arises a sort of reciprocal action, which logically must lead to an extreme. This is the first reciprocal action and the first extreme with which we meet. First reciprocal action. So, as you have already heard, this is really an astonishingly amazing content that we're going to comment on now. It's on the utmost use of force, so fundamentally to the use of violence brought to an extreme, to its maximum. And as we have seen the other day in the previous paragraph, where there was essentially the definition given of war, war is an act of violence intended to compel our opponent to fulfill our will. So now von Clausewitz is still relatively on the realm of theory, because this is all a logical sequence that we will see eventually will lead to a kind of reduction to the use of the utmost use of force, and also we'll see what's the ideas that von Clausewitz has on the concept of total war, that also has been collected eventually with legacy in certain historical chances, but kind of distorting what von Clausewitz was really thinking about. So this is one of my favorite paragraphs in absolute terms from the Vom Krige. So, and I like very much how it starts, because it says immediately something very punching, very powerful, that has led us first of all to reflect on this aspect. Von Clausewitz says that there are people, philanthropists, so people who love their next fundamentally, who may, says, maybe even ironically, easily imagine there is a sort of skillful method of disarming and overcoming an enemy without great bloodshed, and that this is the proper tendency of the art of war. So I personally, I don't know about you, but I think I know people who reason in this way still today. I mean, who believe that fundamentally war should be carried out in a fashion that is meant to kill less people as possible, naturally. Here we're talking about the enemy. We're not talking about civilians, about innocents, because that's a wholly another matter. And also, von Clausewitz, as you have heard, has a favorable thinking, of course, about it. Even though the relation with violence is very complex, because it can lead, however, to certain amounts of destruction. What this is that also involves other objectives, but here von Clausewitz is still is talking theoretically, and then eventually he goes into the other details. Now, so people in general believe that war should be just should be more effective, if this bloodshed is fundamentally reduced. And this doesn't go, in my opinion, just in terms of war in itself, but even into other contexts in which violence is exercised. And here von Clausewitz basically completely dismisses this opinion as something not just useless, but on the contrary, even harmful. So when you have to use violence, in a nutshell, it's better if you use it at its maximum possible, at least, in order to achieve that more quickly and more effectively the result that you have decided to obtain. This is always very important, because you have to remember that von Clausewitz here is not advocating for the use of violence in any case. He's just telling you what you have to do in the case you have decided progressively to use violence. and which is a moral decision you're fundamentally carrying out. So von Clausewitz here does not say, you know, violence should be always used and possibly at the utmost of it. Absolutely not. He says violence, you know, might be used. You might find yourself into a situation in which you have to use it fundamentally. And if this is the case, and therefore you're fighting against someone, the best option for you at all times, and I would say also the best option in general, even for the system as such, is to carry out violence at its maximum in order to quickly solve the problem fundamentally. Because if you prolong this, and we have seen it with the defense, that is, for instance, the strongest form of war, but with the negative aim fundamentally of delaying, this can create in fact problem both for you and for your enemy. Paradoxically, the enemy you're going to destroy fundamentally. This systemic view is very important because it's also inspired to certain physical conceptions. Here, the utmost use of force fundamentally is a way to save energies, paradoxically, because it brings not to delay the conflict, but to make it end as quickly as possible, and therefore to make the system kind of peaceful again. And von Clausewitz is very harsh, in fact, on such an opinion to reduce bloodshed fundamentally in the act of violence, in the use of violence. Because he even says, you know, however plausible this may appear, because objectively, you know, it's kind of a kind and gentle thought to say, okay, let's make war, but let's try also to be a bit chivalric and not kill each other if we can. And then he analyzes also the case why this may happen, but that's contingential, as we have read. And it says, however, how plausible this may appear, it is still an error, which must be extirpated. So he's very radical into this. For in such dangerous things as war, the errors which proceed from a spirit of benevolence are the worst. And then he explains why. So he doesn't make here a moral point, he makes it a physical point, which is very, very meaningful. Very significant, because he says, as the use of physical power to the utmost extent by no means excludes the cooperation of the intelligence, so you can't practically exclude the intelligence from the use of violence in itself. So it's not mere violence that stems, you know, breaks out of the blue and you can't direct it. So you have always a control fundamentally on this violence, albeit you know, war in itself may start fundamentally. You may it may get out of hand fundamentally, because this might happen. Also because if you get into a fight into which the enemy resists or even strikes back, you may not be able to cope with this effectively. But here's making the point that fundamentally you always use violence with a certain degree of control on it, at least especially when it concerns the violence that you are exercising. Then it says, it follows that he who uses force unsparingly, so without fundamentally blocking, you know, without you know, reducing the amount of force, without reference to the bloodshed involved. So in spite of what the consequences of this use of force will be, must obtain a superiority if his adversary uses less vigor in its application. This is very important, because here is telling you, you know, this here, it doesn't matter in the bloodshed involved, because the bloodshed involved is contingential. It can be, there might be fights without bloodshed, indeed. Even if you use a deterrent force, you can fundamentally make an enemy surrender without necessarily massacring him. But you know, will still, however, the threat that you're doing. So this is very contingential. But what it says in here is that given here, it doesn't say that explicitly, but it says that fundamentally, if the conditions were equal, because I can't otherwise interpret it in a different way. If you have two enemies that fight against each other, and one uses force, his force unsparingly, and the other has less vigor, given that these two contenders have the same force, it's kind of a self-evident mathematical law that he who uses most of its force will obtain a degree of superiority, at least, on his adversary, where this adversary uses less vigor in force. It's also important then, here he says, he must obtain a superiority in the sense that not necessarily using force at its utmost brings to victory, but you still can, because there are other factors fundamentally that are involved, maybe into the fight, that, or the enemy might have less vigor but still more energies to spend. So in that case he might receive this blow initially, but still you might get exhausted before you take him down. So these are events that can happen, but here von Clausewitz is really talking about the superiority you can obtain in this first context, where you exercise more force in your in this very moment of your adversary. So, and in fact he says the former, so he who uses force unsparingly, dictates the law to he who uses less vigor in the application of force. And that says, and both proceed to extremities to which the only limitations are those imposed by the amount of counteracting force on each side. So these guys practically are clashing one against the other, and the only options that they have to resist, to especially here, if you're the example we're making before, now the enemy is at this point is using more force than you do, so tendentially now you are the enemy is dictating the law to you, how this thing has conducted, but nevertheless you can still strike back, so you can counteract with your own force, and you are fundamentally fighting to get the enemy, to disarm the enemy, to render the enemy offensive fundamentally, as we've seen in the previous paragraph. So going to these two extremes that are either I crush you, you crush me. Then it says that there is the way in which the matter must be viewed, and it is to no purpose. It is even against one's own interest to turn away from the consideration of the real nature of the affair, because of the order of its elements excites repugnance. Here, that's also a very logical point. He basically says, it's useless that you engage into violence, fundamentally, into war, if you already think that you're gonna feel a repugnance towards the use of violence, because it doesn't make sense. I mean, it's as if you get into a football player, if you football game, if you don't like to kick a ball, it doesn't make any sense. So, and it's even especially, and this is the real point, against your own interest in the first place to behave like that, because once you get into war, you can't say, oh, just let's stop because I don't like the use of violence, because the enemy is gonna smash your face at that point. So it doesn't make any sense, and it's even against your own interest. So it's not just useless, as we said before, but it's even it's even harmful in this condition. Then von Clausewitz talks about this. He basically prevents certain observations and gets to the practical side, on the practical side, comparing fundamentally the differences that exist in the way war and violence is delivered fundamentally, or is expressed, how you want to call it, into different societies in the world. And he makes this dichotomy, he draws this dichotomy of the civilized people and the savages. So von Clausewitz is a man of his time. The Europeans at the time felt like to be the most advanced population in the world, and there was colonialism going on. they were getting acquainted with these other populations that were more primitive all around the world, and they observed their costumes, that naturally also in terms of this idea of savagery, this idea that, I don't know, that obviously tribal warfare, other things is more, sometimes it's more gratuitously cruel, or at least there were certain practices that the to the eyes of the Westerners were fundamentally awful, etc., and that were theoretically prevented on the Western battlefields. So, talking about war, naturally, but here von Clausewitz also gets to a conclusion that is very, very meaningful, because he's not meaning to make a distinction. Actually, he says war fundamentally works for all men, for all humans, in the same way. In spite of these evident differences, and now he explains why. Because he says, if the wars of civilized people are less cruel and destructive than those of the savages, which is perfectly debatable in many ways, and he comes to debate it, in fact, at the end, the difference arises from the social condition both of states in themselves and in their relations to each other. Out of this social condition and its relation, war arises, and by it war is subjected to conditions, is controlled and modified. So he's practically saying the way different peoples in the world carry out war, and it appears as if especially the wars of civilized people are less cruel and destructive than those of the savages. It's not really because of war. I should have completed the paragraph, because he says, but these things do not belong to war itself. They are only given conditions, and to introduce into the philosophy of war itself a principle of moderation would be an absurdity. And he explains why, because it says war is not something that happens just so. I mean, violence is delivered by someone, is an act that is decided, is enacted in fact by someone. And this someone lives into these social conditions in the states and in the relations within each other, so that certain conventions that already existed at the time, and the right of war, sparing necessary blood bath of civilians or innocents, etc., is something that does not really pertain to the use of war in itself, which is always carried out fundamentally in the same way as an act of violence. But this act of violence is simply guided, is controlled and modified, it says, given these relations that exist between in the Western world, fundamentally. So here, basically, von Clausewitz is preluding fundamentally to the most famous quote that war is a prosecution of politics by other means, so that the war is an instrument of politics fundamentally, and politics can in fact control and modify. And as we've read before, war is not pure violence, it's regulated by intelligence as well. So what he's saying in here is that, if two states fight against each other, their goal is fundamentally to disarm the enemy. But there might be conditions between these two states that also are intrinsically related, not maybe to such philanthropic ideals, but to the mere limits fundamentally that existed at the time. Just at the time, it was pretty complicated, let's say, to wipe out an entire enemy state. They tried to do this all the time. But there was, for example, the pretty evident situation for which, these wars were sometimes frontier wars, or things that had to come to an end at one point, and the relations with the states had to be maintained in some way. So in that case, for instance, being unnecessarily cruel, for instance, against someone else, or directly destructive, might have not been favorable, because maybe in strictly strategical or tactical function, this would have been good. You want to really destroy the enemy, but at the same time, this might have created more problems afterwards in the political relations between those states after the end of a war that was known not to be decisive, for instance. And this would open to other considerations, that is fundamentally that, as von Clausewitz will say afterwards, and it is amazing, it, at least implicitly, is that fundamentally these limits are the only ones that control and modify war, because when you don't have these limits and you can objectively exercise the utmost use of force and to wipe out an entire country, you can do it pretty easily. And we saw it during the 20th century, for instance. Not that certain conventions had come less, not that there was this total war for which everybody could really destroy each other. It was always a balance. Think just about the, I don't know, the military the production of war, the economy of war, all the limits that exist in this sense. So also the diplomatic relations with other countries, in a fluid context where you may need someone we've been enemy with before, stuff like that. So those are all things that reduce war, but the way war manifests itself has nothing to do with these factors. Von Clausewitz is pretty clear. It says, but these things do not belong to war in itself. They may control and modify war, but war is another thing with a domain on its own, fundamentally. And in this domain, the utmost use of force is always kind of the standard. You can't do without that, because that's if you reduce the amount of force, you fundamentally are harming yourself and causing more damage to the system, even as a whole. So he says, in fact, they are only given conditions. It's only fundamentally how the political body wants to use that force, the conditions under which that force has to be unleashed. But once you unleash it, a bomb is the same. It doesn't matter what the political aim, the political intent of that specific war really is, because that's how wars are fought. And then, and to introduce, he says, to introduce into the philosophy of war itself a principle of moderation would be an absurdity. So it doesn't make any sense. War has the objective of disarming your enemy, and the best way to do it is to make the utmost use of force. Then if this is tied by other political considerations, that's another matter. But war in itself works in this way, and you always tend towards the utmost use of force. You always, you don't even tend, I mean, you constantly push towards that, if you can, if you're not controlled by some other reason. Then he explains further, there are two motives which lead men to war: instinctive hostility and hostile intention. So instinctive hostility would be, I don't know, I look at a guy on the street and he's I don't like him because he's weird. I don't know, I feel bad instinctively. I dislike him, and that's an instinctive hostility. Then there is the hostile intention, for which maybe that guy has done something to me which I don't like, so I have a kind of even a rational reason for disliking this person, for having suffered from him something that I want to get repaid for, possibly with interests, because at that point I had a bit of instinctive hostility that goes beyond reason. So in our definition of war, von Clausewitz says, we have chosen as its characteristic the latter of these elements, because it is the most general. This is very important. In fact, he says, it goes on, it clarifies, it is impossible to conceive the passion of hatred of the wildest description bordering on mere instinct without combining with it the idea of a hostile intention. This is a very important consideration under political military point of view, because von Clausewitz rightfully says, there can be this kind of instinctive hostility, a conflictual nature, if you want, underlying the human this conflict underlying human nature fundamentally. But when you hate fundamentally someone at its wildest, that it seems even bordering on mere instinct, it's practically impossible not to have some further reason for really hating that person, not to have certain hostile intention for which you want that person to be taken down fundamentally, to be overthrown, as von Clausewitz says. So when von Clausewitz explains, when we gave the definition of war, we are fundamentally assuming that war is usually dictated by a hostile intention that is dictated not just by instinctive hostility, but by some concrete necessary reason that brings you into the fight, into the duel. So it's something that is also pretty dramatic in itself. I mean, the act of war, as we've seen, is an act of violence. So that entails already, a cost that, if anything, you have to, in order to exercise violence most of the times, you have to do. And given that war is especially fought when the odds are relatively uncertain, because otherwise there wouldn't be even need to use violence, but you could simply coerce someone through deterrence, you always have to have a good reason to get yourself into a situation where you could possibly lose, even with some consistent probability. So von Clausewitz says, when we look at war fundamentally, we cannot exclude the instinctive hostility that still exists, but most of the time it's really hostile intention that directs violence in itself, and it's really the here it says the because this element is the most general, so it's the one that basically exists at all times, and not that instinctive hostility has to be left as unnoticed. And in fact, von Clausewitz says, on the other hand, hostile intentions may often exist without being accompanied by any, or at all events by an extreme hostility of feelings. So here it says basically that certain wars can also be unleashed without a particular by particular hatred. I mean, just think about World War I, where the poor soldiers in the frontier, in the trenches, that were fundamentally fighting against each other, but yeah, they surely had hostility of feeling by certain standards, but sometimes they just, look at each other and said, okay, these are poor desperates just like we are, who have been sent in here, and I have really no, I might do it for the state, for my family, for God, for whatever, but because there is a sacred relation. I mean, these are relation with politics and how you see duty and stuff like that. But I really have no hatred towards the guy I'm shooting in front of me, and I just have to do it because I'm forced to do it fundamentally. Then von Clausewitz distinguish amongst savages. Once again, in civilized nations, says, amongst savages, views emanating from the feelings; amongst civilized nations, those emanating from the understanding have the predominance. So here he draws a distinction, fundamentally saying that these primitive worlds, the tribal worlds, I would call it, would, according to him, basically more dominated by feelings. Now this is kind of debatable naturally, because there is always if even in primitive societies, in tribal contexts, etc., we may see how certain feelings are definitely overwhelming, but that is, even if even the same primitives do not know it, a sort of rationalization, a social rationalization, or adjustment, as you want to do it, for quite as you want to say it, for quite reasonable reasons. I mean, the tribal society is dominated by such strong feelings, because these strong feelings are somewhat necessary in order to make that society survive. This has been exchanged, it keeps being exchanged fundamentally for kind of negative characters. Of course, the warrior gets defeated by the soldier, and this other bullshit that, concepts that you find all around the internet. The warriors are superior to soldiers and that they are better. And it's all rubbish. It just for the record, it's all the other way. It's the other way around. Athena always wins over Ares. And history gave us quite of a proof of this. But even feelings in that particular context are still functional to that society. It obviously has some limits, but that basically polarizes and or orientates, however, even war, certain dynamics to take place. I mean, the for instance, the feeling of hatred towards a neighboring tribe might be necessary in that specific anthropological context to drive the tribe to win over that other, for fighting over certain resources that are not enough for both. So in that case, exteriorly, you may say, oh well, look at those, how savages, how much they hate each other, but that's still functional to their world. So naturally here we have to contextualize also von Clausewitz at the beginning of the 19th century what the ideas in generally were towards a certain, but it's still relatively actual in many ways. I mean, really, in fact, von Clausewitz eventually brings this these differences to fundamentally as a contingent factor, whereas war fundamentally functions in both these societies in the same way at the end of the day. So von Clausewitz is very clever because he's able to distinguish this and to observe how war actually follows the same tracks, and we will see also how he reveals that even among civilized nations, of course, the instinctive hostility is pretty much out there, and it's a mistake to think that it's as if, as he says, that it's just good government that fundamentally is a pure reasonable thing that leads war, and that people's feelings have no importance at all. Von Clausewitz is, on the contrary, is in his theory bringing on this very important aspect of the popular feelings of a nation towards that as also as an influencing factor in the process of war making, fundamentally leading to war. We were reading. It's making this distinction that among savages, views emanating from feelings; among civilized nations, those emanating from the understanding have the predominance. So he basically attributes, as we've seen, to the tribesmen this kind of more instinctive hostility, and to the civilized nations, as he calls them, more an hostile intention. So an intention that derives more from understanding and reason, and that therefore leads war on these premises. But finally, and this is very important, he says this difference arises from attendant circumstances, existing institutions, etc., and therefore it is not to be found necessarily in all cases, although it prevails in the majority. So what he's saying here is fundamentally the two things are mixed all the time. You can have societies in which instinctive hostility prevails over hostile intention, and vice versa. And generally there is this trend that the more the society is developed in a way, and the more this the balance goes in favor of hostile intention, because there's a sort of rationalization and understanding. And this is kind of normal, because more developed societies are also more difficult to manage, so they necessarily produce some more sophisticated meanings to understand, that they're kind of more rational, more secular, if you want, even to understand war not just as a state of nature like you might find in tribalism, but as, you know, with some objectives that go beyond. But it says here it's just attendant circumstances. It's just because there are those institutions, because this society is fundamentally different, differ in as societies, in fact. But this mix is always existed. And he adds, finally, probably the most beautiful phrase: in short, even the most civilized nations may burn with passionate hatred of each other. And this is pretty evident. I would say that now, well, we don't have time for discussing this, but it's nevertheless very interesting because it's still true today, in many ways. It happens, and it's perhaps always there. You know, even, you know, just to look at today's Europe, we have really certain issues going on. There are let's leave aside the most evident problem now with the Ukraine, Russia, etc. But, you know, even thinking about the Balkans, there are so many problems in there still basically unresolved. There is, even in Western Europe, some kind of still of, I can't say hatred necessarily, but kind of instinctive hostility, like, you know, I don't know, those two countries do not like each other, or they have this this particular passive hostility in which kind of still exists, and maybe is rooted in their cultures, their suspicions about each other. This always exists, and still exists. So this does not lead to war necessarily. Maybe in Western Europe, you see in Eastern Europe, maybe certain political decisions that are taken for very reasonable, I mean, very rational, let's say better, reasons, for which, you know, there is that strategic goal, I can seize it, fine, but it's still fueled maybe by political propaganda, or by really even common feeling, by this sense of hatred that still exists. Personally, I talk with some with people from some certain nationalities from that context, specifically in the war in the Ukraine. I've heard certain things from these people that were extremely disturbing to me. I mean, really, in terms of hatred, that was pure hatred, and not just because you know, of the consequences of that war, but just, you know, something that existed progressively. You know, I don't know as you say it in English. Yeah, previously, not progressively. Sorry, previously. So it's these things do exist, and are kind of deeply rooted. We know it in the way we are as human beings, and the way we look at the group, and how our it's written in our genes in many ways. The way we have this kind of still extremely instinctive feelings that are pretty irrational, and that are played on by politics many times. Because they work, because we do work as humans in this fashion. So von Clausewitz in here is extremely objective. He's not making a point, you know, saying this is good or bad. This is simply saying, look, this is how it happens. This is how it is. Then deal with it, because this is useful. You know, if you don't want to believe it, do as you like, but just know that if you ever get into a war, if you ever get to enact violence, you have to be aware of the factors that play into this, because your success may depend on them. On the contrary, we can say it does depend on them as a whole. Excuse me. Then he goes on. We may see from this what a fallacy it would be to refer the war of a civilized nation entirely to an intelligent act on the part of the government, and to imagine it as continually freeing itself more and more from all feeling of passion in such a way that at least the physical masses of combatants would no longer be required. In reality, their mere retaliations would suffice, a kind of algebraic action. So here what it's saying is what we stated now, that is fundamentally it's pretty naive and actually wrong to pretend that governments are purely rational entities that declare war according to in fact perfect mathematical calculations. It's realistic. Governments are influenced constantly by such feelings of passions, fundamentally, if anything, because the people they rule on are essentially animated by these feelings. And if it was so, if we had a purely intelligent government, you could say that you wouldn't even need armies, because at that point everything would the relation between governments would be reduced to a sort of only a kind of algebraic action, and everything would be it would be pure being, pure spirit, I don't know what. And it doesn't make sense, because it's an unrealistic depiction of reality. Now, I don't know whether I'm interpreting von Clausewitz well here or not, but here it's saying something very meaningful, that is, we would all like, in a way, that wars did not exist, and that that governments would fundamentally just sort out the best option, and that everything would go in the way it has to go. Maybe it's not so better, in the sense we don't really know where society would go at that point, but this is really the point he's making. This is not real. This is not realistic. That wouldn't be a society. Societies are animated by these feelings of passion that are irrational. Government are generally more reasonable than the masses of people. This is true in relative terms. When you get to the top of a society, in order to rule it, you have immediately drop your idealism and trying to succeed, even to carry out such governmental measures, because you have to rule over these masses. So doesn't matter whether you're a totalitarian leader or a democratically elected one, but politics presents you with certain very cynical choices, decisions that you have to take out if you really want to rule. There is nothing like a perfect government. There is nothing like first of all, a perfect mind that can rule, but secondly, there is no, even if it existed, people would fundamentally still be fallacious. They would still be animated by these feelings. So this is something you have to take into consideration, even and especially when you go to war, because this means that it's as if these decisions were taken in a space where everything is fluid, everything is floating, and this physical, the masses of people express and influence on a very rational base what has to be done fundamentally, and government, albeit trying to put an order into this, is still highly influenced by such pushes, and war therefore it is always fought fundamentally in an it's not really fought, but it's really unleashed. It's really started maybe in an irrational fashion. What's the problem really in wars? Even when you study military history, it's not about how wars were fought, because we suppose that even if there were armies that were naturally better or worse than others, and not just for spiritual, for moral reasons, but also technically speaking. More or less, when you go to war, you know, you go there because you have more or less the certainty you can fight with a certain degree of efficiency. Meaning that, yeah, there can be factors for which you're gonna be obliterated because you're weaker, you're etc. But actually, when it comes to combat, things are tend to be usually pretty standard, pretty functional. The closer you get to the battlefield. But wars are fundamentally won and lost, respectively, chiefly because of higher decisions, chiefly strategical ones. And even the same decisions to go to war, to go at war with someone, might be fundamentally wrong. It might be fundamentally, at least, let's not say wrong because it sounds too moralistic, but it could be too hasty, for instance, without enough preparation. Why? Because that was a political decision that was pushed by certain factors that eventually do not take into consideration what is going to happen on the ground. Maybe a war is started for reasonable reasons, let's say motives, but eventually is carried out in a very poor way because more than the military side, it's really the political and social aspect of the world that is completely lacking. It means you can be the strongest army in the world, but still, not understanding much of what is happening to a specific place, and therefore you know how to destroy, but you don't know how to build everything, to build something afterwards, to put the premises and the basis. And this happened in recent years, we all know it, but I would say that von Clausewitz is telling us here that you can't even make a proper distinction because there are always certain factors, certain modalities into which war is started that in fact are irrational. So every war has its own mistakes, every war has its own miscalculations, its own misunderstandings, even before those will come from carrying out war proper, in the act of violence, fundamentally, from a strictly military point of view. So in this sense, human societies go at war for reasons that are probably well thought in general, but that are met constantly with so many changes, with so many miscalculations at the end of the day, or that for reasons that really evolve over time, that that wars are never rationally declared. Or I know it sounds bad in the way I say it now, but it's as if there's always a factor of risk that you can't fundamentally even fully assess when you start a war, or at least you might assess, but it's always there. Things could always go wrong. There could be there is always, this is the point, a miscalculation. There is always an imperfection. There is always some reason, and especially you have things that can go wrong, especially you have someone else from the other side that is counter-reacting. So you're not acting against a passive object that you just take to destroy physically. You're acting against someone else who is animated, who can inflict heavy blows on you as well, and you don't know everything about that entity. And the history of war is constantly the history of trying also of figuring out what essentially your enemy is about. Because this is one of the most important problems of war, and the fog of war is always out there in so many ways, for which even the act of violence in itself is rendered useless sometimes, because there are broader contexts that have not been taken properly into consideration by politics, and that therefore may, unleash a terrible war, but without reaching any substantial result, or even being defeated. So this happens all the time, This is not saying this war happened in this way or this in other. Of course, the outcome is different. Of course, there are wars that are successful. There are, states will win and others will lose. But at the same time, in between, there is always something that the two contenders basically learned from this experience they didn't know before, and that did create problems during war in itself. So, just to sum up, here von Clausewitz is saying wars do not happen in a fully rational way. If it was so, there wouldn't be even need to go to war, because everything would be calculated in advance. We would perfectly know what things would be like, and we would already know in advance whether it's war to fight or not. And if the other knew that as well, he would simply surrender because he would know he can make it. So this would be just an algebraic calculation, and this is absolutely not what happens in reality. Reality is completely different, and this is another good reason to try to sort out fundamentally so many factors, and especially not to underestimate the passion, the feeling of passion of a people to this matter, because a government also fights on the momentum given by this feeling of passion as well. So it's pretty evident, and this feeling of passion might die out also pretty quickly, and make the government fundamentally lacking the moral strengths from the citizenry, let's say, or the subjects, wherever we're talking about, to carry out on the war. This is pretty evident. Think about so many. Think about World War the First or World War the Second. This is typical. There were so many countries that were kind of even if unprepared, were kind of fine at going to war, and some of them, after terrible massacres, defeats, etc., basically, lost all will to fight, and they surrendered in the end in some way. So this happens all the time. There are countless historical examples that are really as many as all the wars that have been fought, because this happens constantly in all the wars in some ways. It's a sort of reciprocal action. The idea that when you go to war, you start a duel, you enact violence, you have some reasons, some expectations, and then maybe you can find a nut that is too hard to be cracked, and you say, okay, you know what, I bail out because I thought it was easier. It's not. I'm meeting difficulties. I don't want to go on. And the only problem is that, in fact, the nut can at that point take over you. So you get defeated. So you not only back off from it, but you may not be able to do so, and you would have to suffer all the additional consequences of a not just of an attempted attack, but also by a failed on a failed defense at that point, because you might be overwhelmed by the enemy as well. So von Clausewitz goes on and says, theory was beginning to drift in this direction until the facts of the last war taught it better. So von Clausewitz here is alluding to the so-called wars of liberation. So from a Prussian perspective, the ones starting from 1813, the Battle of Leipzig, and all the, in fact, the liberation, let's say, of Germany from the Napoleonic domination. This was a very, as you know, probably it was a very important moment in German history, because it went in parallel with the revival of a German national feeling. So this was a very important moment also for later movements of creation of a German national state. We're fundamentally into the Romantic era. So Romanticism emphasizes the this kind of national feelings that are, in fact, as von Clausewitz stresses, they're kind of feelings of passion. They're kind of irrational. They stem from cultural reasons. So this common feeling was particularly felt into this specific context. What is interesting is that von Clausewitz points out that theory was beginning to drift into the direction of a sort of in fact, impersonal and rational direction of war until these last wars of liberation. At least until these last wars of liberation taught it better. Not that probably this feeling had ever been fully conceived. I mean, 18th century warfare hadn't obviously believed that really war could arrive to a sort of an algebraic action. But it's nevertheless important that von Clausewitz points this out, because the 18th century saw this, for many reasons, this kind of idea for which there could be a scientific manner to sort out the outcome of wars. Fundamentally, von Clausewitz, with his Vom Krige, also criticizes this kind of mathematical, manualistic approach to war, for which everything can be resolved simply by moving the troops in the right direction and just hoping to win in such a fashion. Von Clausewitz powerfully introduces this the importance fundamentally of not just of the moral resources that obviously are at the base of war, that it was already known since ever. Fundamentally, obviously von Clausewitz didn't invent it, but he started to give this enormous importance also to the feelings of the nations, of the peoples, that have a very strong influence also into the direction of war. After all, this is how even the times had changed, in the sense that, thinking about before the French Revolution and the Napoleonic era, the absolutistic powers that were absolute up to a certain point, telling the truth, but they had fundamentally believed there could be a sort of only kind of mechanically driven political and military action, for which troops and therefore peoples had fundamentally just to obey to the sovereign and do whatever the state asked them. So hence this highly intellectual, cerebral idea of government that can dispose of the masses without any consequence. The French Revolution, also the American Revolution previously, but this was particularly more evident in Europe in many ways, especially at a strictly national level. I mean, where there were several nations, one close to the other, that in this sense interacted quite. The American context was relatively different. But in fact, these wars of liberations had proven fundamentally that there was much more than just politics and military without society, fundamentally without a people that as if people were just passive observers of what happened and that they hadn't any influence on this. The wars of liberations were felt as something more, something into which finally certain nations of Europe were trying to struggle for their own independence, from their own an independence that was very identitary in many ways, that stressed their own political unity, their cultural unity. Of course, the idea of nation state is very dangerous. It's done a lot of damages, but contextualizing it in its time, it had its motives, it had its reasons, and these popular feelings were really felt to be quite strong. And military history teaches this all the time. I mean, independently from what the philosophy of the time, political philosophies and theories of the time really were, but you see in history constantly that at a certain point, more than the sheer military defeats. What really counts in a war is also the moral support of the whole political and social system. If after a terrible defeat you're annihilated, even economically speaking, you don't have any resource to oppose, or at least the things is starting to become inconvenient, the people withdraws, and you can't make an army fight without people, especially at this time in history where you can't start seeing really mass levies of millions of troops that were fighting on Napoleonic battlefields. Of Europe, obviously not at once, but altogether, the Napoleonic Wars mobilitated millions and millions and made die millions and millions. And just think about what the effect here. You need a popular feeling, you need a popular sentiment to go to war in such a fashion. It's not enough to just occupy one land and to try to make them obey to whatever you do. In fact, the 19th century, even after the Restoration, is in fact remembered as the century of the revolutions, of the uprisings, because even at the time, especially with technology of the time, it was kind of difficult still to control entire populations of millions, and it was pretty complicated, even for politics and the military to contain these masses. The feelings of Vom were therefore crucial also to determine the outcome of such conflicts. So von Clausewitz in here is very thoughtful, very on the spot, and he says, if war is an act of force, it belongs necessarily also to the feelings, which is brilliant, because it's obvious. What do you use force for? You need to hate your enemy. You don't kill someone if you don't hate him. I mean, you can do it theoretically, but it's your intentionality in doing it is always driven by something pretty big. Killing a person is something devastating, but even just aggressing that person physically is something devastating. You have to be animated, agitated by very strong feelings. This is pretty evident. It's something everybody can relate to. Then it says, if war as an act of force does not originate in the feelings, it reacts more or less upon them. And the extent of this reaction depends not on the degree of civilization, but upon the importance and duration of the interests involved. This is perhaps one of the most beautiful phrases in here, because it says this pretty explicitly. War, as we have seen, is driven also by feelings. The act of force entails feelings. So these feelings naturally are mostly dictated, as we've seen, by a sentiment of hostility driven by some motives that have to be good enough to bring you to aggress someone else and putting yourself into to the risk even of losing. And even when you're from the other side, so you get aggressed by your opponent, the act of force you use is fundamentally a reaction upon these, indirectly upon the feelings that your enemies feels towards you. So this is particularly important because when you get aggressed, more or less why, or at least you can expect why, or at least you can see what that person is really trying to aggress you for. So you can feel this very, very closely to you. There is always a kind of instinctive reaction of hostility that gets triggered, in fact, as a reaction. And this is important. This reaction, according to von Clausewitz, does not depend on the degree of civilization. So it doesn't matter whether you're a savage, as von Clausewitz says it, or the most civilized person in the world, most intellectually sophisticated, educated person. The reaction, so the active force that you use to respond to an aggression, really depends upon the importance and duration of the interests involved. So it's very mechanical in many ways, and you can understand if you've ever been into a fight. You know that at that point, your brain basically switches to a mode in which it knows you're into a combat fundamentally, and there are certain interests at stake at that point. If you react to fight back, you must have certain interests. They are more or less important, more or less lasting. This is also particularly important because you may have no reason to fight back as well. So your active force is a response also on the base of what you feel at that point, not just what your opponent wants to do to you. There is a reciprocal action, as we will see, but it still depends also on your side. And this has very meaningful implications, naturally. Then von Clausewitz comes back to the dichotomy, civilized nations and others, and says, therefore, if we find civilized nations do not put their prisoners to death, do not devastate towns and countries, this is because their intelligence exercises greater influence on their mode of carrying on war, and has taught them more effectual means of applying force than these rude acts of mere instinct. Here von Clausewitz says, if you find civilized nations doing things that seem more, human, or humanistic, or philanthropic, as he puts it in first at the beginning of the paragraph, it's not because there is one specific change in the way war is carried out. This will be clearer for the following from the following phrase, but because they have learned pragmatically, so apparently even without any kind of moral reason, that using brutal violence, let's say, for mere instinct is actually inconvenient. It's actually ineffective. It doesn't really work. So here he makes this interesting list. He says putting prisoners to death, for instance, devastating towns and countries. Now this can be debatable, because even during Napoleonic Wars many prisoners were put to death, and many towns and countries were devastated. So here von Clausewitz obviously is not naive. He is perfectly aware of this, but there was obviously a tendency into this context to act upon certain rules in general that naturally are broken. In fact, in the previous paragraph we have read how there are certain conventions that are fundamentally accepted, maybe, but that sometimes are virtually ininfluent. Most of the times, actually, they're virtually ininfluent in the way violence is practically delivered. It's like during World War II. I mean, even when fighting against countries that were tyrannic in many ways, or had, they were slaughtering civilians in millions for, violent, irrational ideologies, you still had certain military decisions that were perfectly aware, for instance, that a certain amount of civilians would die. And this was carried out anyway. Think about Germany, was razed to the ground. At that point, there's been a debate, rightfully, because it appears that even in strictly military terms, this didn't have much of a great effect eventually on the ultimate German will to continue the war, and on the contrary, kind of harshened certain feelings. It was even difficult for the Allies to make it through sometimes. So and here all many consequences that eventually happen in politics, in culture, and that were quite important. So this was just a banal, relatively banal example, but that doesn't fully explain what I wanted to say. But just for saying that, however, certain rules that are created do not derive from humanity, or what we call as humanity, because here von Clausewitz is fundamentally telling you that well, here we venture into a complicated domain, but let's say that here von Clausewitz is not talking about morality. He tells you that there are more, as he calls them, there are more effectual means of applying force than just doing it for slaughtering civilians or to kill, prisoners, devastating, etc. So early at his time, these international conventions were pretty alive, let's say. But at the same time, what he concludes with is that war, at the end of the day, however, has always this ultimate aim of the utmost use of force. And he says a phrase that I think should be sculpted in everybody's minds, because it's really the answer to, if you really want to understand how the whole thing is here in war, that's what it, and historically also, how it really is. Von Clausewitz introduces it talking about gunpowder. We could use it talking about atomic, nuclear weapons, but it means the exact same. He says, the invention of gunpowder, the constant progress of improvements in the construction of firearms, are sufficient proofs that the tendency to destroy the adversary, which lies at the bottom of the conception of war, is no way changed or modified through the progress of civilization. I repeat it because this is dramatically important. The invention of gunpowder, the constant progress of improvements in the construction of firearms, are sufficient proofs that the tendency to destroy the adversary, which lies at the bottom of the conception of war, is in no way changed or modified through the progress of civilization. I don't know if you understand at fullest the meaning of this phrase, because this is terrifying, this is terrible. It's basically telling you that it doesn't matter how civilization progresses and allegedly batters from our subjective perspective, war has never changed. The destructiveness of human war does not decrease with by the progress of civilization, and this is pretty self-evident. We have nuclear weapons now. The only reason why we live in a relatively peaceful moment in history is greatly in part due to the deterrent presented by nuclear weapons, not because we are gentle souls or we have civilized and progressed. We are still the same apes of 2,000 years ago, even of 4,000 years ago. We are the same exact animals. We function in the same exact way, and all our ideals are something that, when you get into violence, vanish. You get into war, vanish immediately. It's all the more meaningful, considering this phrase. Considering that von Clausewitz had, in the previous phrase, just stated that fundamentally there had been some kind of, less instinctual nature of war being developed in the West. But he says, look, that this does not correspond to a more philanthropic, of tendency of an increased philanthropic tendency of the human nature. Absolutely not. This is only due to a sort of mechanical, pragmatic conveniency that showed us that massacring civilians, prisoners, devastating, is not really something that makes you win a war faster. It's not because you really think about those people. It's really because it's not useful. It could be even counterproductive. And he says, when you look at the development of gunpowder, but here we could say of military technology as a whole from our 2019 perspective, which it's still the same. Von Clausewitz is just throwing there an example, but he's perfectly aware it's the whole, it's the whole history works in this way. It doesn't matter which technology you invent. The amount of destruction has increased, right? It's pretty evident. One thing, it's as if the aim of the utmost use of force was always the same. This is what von Clausewitz has written this paragraph in the Vom Krige for. He says, war doesn't change. The way humans get into a fight, get into war, and they battle against each other, they combat against each other, is the same identical way, and it always tends towards the utmost use of force. So what humans did throughout all history, passing through stone and sticks, or arrows and catapults, or cannons and rifles, or missiles and nuclear weapons, is essentially the same exact thing, to maximize the effects of destruction. And this is true. This is true, and is devastating, but it is the truth. And von Clausewitz doesn't hide behind saying, oh no, we should be also gentle and kind. It says no, and you know why? Because if you didn't use that mean, war would be fundamentally even more destructive than this, because you would make it prolong in a way that would take out many more other people. So here, there are so many references you could do, even to current international politics and conflicts that are being fought all over the world now. You can't look at war simply saying it's bad because it's war, because that's not really a point. First of all, war is an instrument of politics, so you should wonder why politics led to that. So you should concentrate first of all on the responsibility of your actions, not looking at war because it's so scenographic, it's so theatrical, it's so brutally fascinating, even as a sort of show that we watch on TV, etc. You should concentrate on the fact that that act of violence has been unleashed by someone willingly. It's not something that happens. It's not like a pear that grows on a tree. It's something that has been carried out by humans who thought about it thoroughly, that have taken that decision for a very precise reason. That maybe you don't know, because all you know is that war is terrible, but you don't know why it's fought, and this is terrible at the same time, because in Clausewitzian terms this means that in the case you get into that war, you're basically screwed, because you can't even understand what the hell is going on in the first place. It's as if you were sort of those savages that he talks about, those primitives. And secondly, I would say it shows you the necessity, once you have taken the decision of fighting, at least theoretically, because here we are still in the realm of theory, that it's useless for you to preserve your energies. If you have them, you can unleash them at the moment, because this kind of gradual release of violence is most of the times, if there are at least not other reasons that we have seen, contingent reasons that are kind of controlling and modifying it, it's kind of useless, because basically prolongs the war, prolongs the atrocities, prolongs the sufferances, and when you can wipe out the enemy in one shot and you don't do it, you're just stupid, and you're kind of criminal, even if you're not stain your hands with blood. This is also a very important thing to say, that war, this is the real point that I think that we have to understand, that making war and not making war does not equate necessarily to being evil and to be good, respectively. Because if you don't take action, you don't take arms sometimes to fight, for instance, against tyranny, even if you don't kill anyone personally, you're letting other people being killed. And this is a crime in the same exact way, and it's on your head, because you could do it and you didn't. So this naturally opens to also wider philosophical considerations, but this is not important now, but just to make you reflect how, on the fact that using the military instrument is not necessarily something, and its utmost, if you can, it's not necessarily something negative or positive in itself. It only depends, that only depends on why you're doing that for, or not doing it for. And it's dramatic. I think in the West, especially today, we're kind of, for certain political reasons that I think are evident most independently from how you think about it politically, because I also totally should have, but it's as if in the West we were retracting by saying, okay, now things are going kind of bad because the economy is not so good, we have problems, we have other competitors, let's enclose in ourselves. Let's say, okay, I don't want to know what's happening, even in countries that are maybe close to me geographically, but I feel I have nothing to do with. Because even if you don't care, even if you really can say, okay, I don't care about people dying, because many of us do it, let's be honest about it, and all people in the world do it in some measure, but what is happening there is something that is going to influence you, and the people were being killed, and that you could have, let's say, not really helped because you for a philanthropic reason, but at least to have helped to prevent other problems that will happen in the future to you because of your non-intervention, is in fact a terrible thing, is a stupid thing. And von Clausewitz would be pretty upset about what is happening now, and the way we are kind of regressing on the base of what's happening now in our civilization. I would say, on the light of what we have read, now we have just the last very paragraph, the very last sentence to complete, but I feel, at least personally, that we're talking about the masses and the feelings of passion von Clausewitz talks about. It's as if in the West we were kind of increasing that instinctive feelings and reducing our understanding. I think that even if people were on average definitely more ignorant back in the day, or I mean the generation of our parents or our grandparents, but those people understood far better in some way, or at least their governments understood, and for some reasons that now are kind of difficult to explain, also in the relation with masses and so on, which is not necessarily a brighter picture, but I think that at that time, also because of the Cold War and this imminent threat and mental hostility was looming over us, it was that it was clearer that the understanding is superior to feelings, fundamentally, and there is a sort of, qualitative edge that reason has on feelings. And it seems as if, we were coming back now, we were regressing. Part of the reason, I think, of this is we live fundamentally better than the people who came before us. I mean, in terms of strictly of quality of life, so we get less industrious because we kind of already have what we need in part. And yeah, I know there are people who do not live very well now, but they're still, even poor people today are infinitely more, more privileged than people who lived, 50 years ago, 100 years ago. So we shouldn't complain. But this, in fact, brings us to lack completely any perspective on the point. It's as if, we got more instinctual, as if we were, because we were used to have everything, we don't have to make our reason work in order to get what we need, and because we give it for granted, and therefore we became kind of lazier, or kind of less prone to, you know, to go out there and work it and earn it, and feeling what it costs. So personally, I don't have a great I don't have a very romantic view of the past. I don't think we objectively, there was a better past. I don't think so, but I still think that people who lived back then, albeit more ignorant, albeit also, with certain ideas that might have been very criticizable today, had, however, much clearer these dynamics. The concept of understanding in terms of, what the consequences of your action are going to be. This might as well be a mistake. I'm not saying that. I think today we might even be better. I don't know, maybe I'm wrong. I hope so, because there is also this tendency of feeling that your own time are kind of always worse than the ones that came before. So probably I'm mistaken as well. I generally tend not to make that mistake, because in fact I think I use more understanding than feelings. But perhaps the most accurate consideration you can make is that given the improvement of our world, it's as if in proportion people lagged behind compared to those who came before. Not because in absolute terms they are worse. Maybe really not. It's not really the case. But given the complexity of our current world and the development of our current world, we are kind of in proportion much more ignorant than people were before. Objectively, the older world was kind of simpler, also to understand. In many ways, then I don't know whether people even there had kind of a clear idea in this sense of what the world really was. It was in proportion better than the way we have it now about our own, but it's still a thought we should spend in this sense. So, looking at the progress of civilization, we should remind von Clausewitz's words, because he makes us observe that it's not because our life became better that we can simply say, okay, war is something you can do without, fundamentally, or just use kind of a reduced manner. You should just be about dialogue. You should be able to dialogue, because that's a hell of a useful way to solve conflicts. And we do dialogue internationally, diplomatically. There is something like that, but at the same time, it's the feeling of the masses that is kind of getting totally disoriented, in my opinion, in front of the relation between politics and war. And there should be, I think, a mandatory school teaching about this Clausewitzian principles, because they tell it all, actually quite simply. Now, I'm able to ramble for hours about even von Clausewitz's paragraph, and indeed, you could make an entire university course on even on such a relatively small paragraph. But the essentials of these statements are pretty easy to learn, and I think we should form the future citizens with these ideas pretty clear in mind. At least this is, in my opinion, much better than what is being done in schools today. And I don't know, maybe schools have bettered. I ended school almost 9 years ago, so I don't know how it's changed, but I know that it's not that great much, and I'm actually concerned about what education is really about. I think this is a great moment of change in our history, and as in all the great moments of change, probably the most important thing you have to do is to reorganize education effectively, because that's really, it's an investment for the future, and it's not very costly. It would be very convenient, and that's also part of the reason why I talk about von Clausewitz on YouTube, hoping that someone is interested and is, can lend her own ears to this. So, concluding the last phrase, through which von Clausewitz introduces one of these, excuse me, one of his first, that's actually the first reciprocal action. These reciprocal actions are part of the theory. I remind you that everything is chained in von Clausewitz's theory. It's not really an extemporary reflection. Every paragraph is kind of linked one to the other, so we will find these reciprocal actions into place throughout all the work. So here it says, we therefore, or at least we have to bear it in mind constantly. Remember that learning von Clausewitz is extremely difficult. So you can't just, you have to keep everything in mind from what you have heard from before in order to understand what you're reading afterwards. So it's very important. So von Clausewitz says, we therefore repeat our position that war is an act of violence pushed to its utmost bounds. As one side dictates the law to the other, there arises a sort of reciprocal action which logically must lead to an extreme. This is the first reciprocal action and the first extreme with which we meet. First reciprocal action. So here von Clausewitz basically recapitulates the law that he had expressed in the previous paragraph. So he restates now the definition of war that had been defined in the previous chapter as an act of violence intended to compel our opponent to fulfill our will, changing it because it's interchangeable. This is the real point. This is typical von Clausewitz dialectical method because it's very logically grounded. It says, war is an act of violence pushed to its utmost bounds. So the difference between the two phrases is essentially that brings to the equivalence that compelling our opponent to fulfill our will necessitates the pushing violence to its utmost bounds. Sorry. This damn spring. That's why I rarely venture outside, because otherwise I get killed myself. No, fortunately, I don't have great problems with allergy, but I tend to sneeze pretty often. But aside from this interlude, I hope that the concept is quite clear. If you want to compel your opponent to fulfill your will, you cannot avoid, in theory, to push violence to its utmost bounds. That's where you have to head to, fundamentally. Now, we will see how, in this paragraph it's already been introduced, but we will see how, much better how, fundamentally, it's important to stress the theoretical side of this. Not because theory is not important. It's not abstract. This is not an abstraction at all. This is theory, which means that this is how it works. Then there are other factors that intervene to control and modify this utmost use of violence, so that this is often reduced, and therefore every war is kind of it's impossibly aimed at the final consequence, because it might not be convenient. It's like with the nuclear holocaust, for instance. Why did if theoretically during Cold War we could have killed each other altogether. Why didn't we? if we were fundamentally at war, it doesn't matter whether it was a Cold War, because it was frozen, in fact, by nuclear weapons. And guess why? Because nuclear weapons would have wiped us out all. So everybody had to lose, fundamentally, in that game. And from such a result to this utmost bounds, and that's, in fact, the main problem with the use of violence. You have to think of the consequences of it, in part. So that's why, if you get into a brawl, you may get so heated up and extremely instinctive, etc. But you would still tend to avoid in the back of your head to really kill that person, because you know that otherwise you'll go to jail. So there are so many factors that bring you to mitigate, fundamentally, the utmost use of violence. And this is quite important to bear in mind. But nevertheless, it's even more important to bear in mind what, in theory, this is all about. Because if you try to define the middle ground, to build a theory, you can't build one. You only build something approximated, because you go by, by steps, by stages. You say, okay, I have to use violence in this case only for this, only for that. Von Clausewitz is very practical, very pragmatical. He says, this is how it is. Then how you deal with it, it's all upon you. In fact, von Clausewitz in this is very... it's very moral. I mean, it gives such a deep moral teaching, because it tells you fundamentally that, you have to decide, because even knowing is kind of difficult in war. You have to decide when to use violence. I can't tell you when. Of course, von Clausewitz had his own morality, his own principles, his own beliefs, so he knew better in his kind, but in this, history changes. Always bearing in mind that the theory of war is always the same. It never changes. So your ability, consequently, is to be able to understand your own world in order to carry out certain things, not go to the absolutes. So also Clausewitz in theory is this constant push for making you reflect on what your current situation is and how to take measures accordingly, because that's all how you can solve the problem. And this is how wars are solved, practically. Before getting into a war, you should know what you're doing. You should know what the consequences can be. The possible consequences can be. You have to think it through wisely, and then everything evolves also along the way once you get into it. So that's the key. Von Clausewitz here is not telling you how to win a war in the sense that it tells you, he also gets into certain details that are quite technical, quite useful, but his aim is to formulate a theory that you can apply in every situation, having very well clear in mind, very schematically in mind, how the whole thing works, and then the measure of all the factors is left to you, and good luck with that, because it's a hell of a difficult thing to do. It takes to be a military genius to figure out certain things. Most of people are not, and also many people are not even versed for fighting, for war. So this is also a very important thing. That would be an enormous amount of things to discuss, and I hope on Schwerpunkt to do it sooner or later, to maybe turn, also in here, to look better at military history, because also according to von Clausewitz, military history is really an extremely precious resource in this sense, because even without allowing you to, it does allow, and it did with von Clausewitz himself, allow to formulate the theory, but in this sense military history and the experience deriving from it is something that goes even beyond certain explanations. You need a kind of an intelligence on your own, a criticism that you have to develop. So there are no easy answers, and this is probably one of the wisest conclusions you can get to, and that definitely the reading of the Vom Krige leads you. with. So read von Clausewitz, moral of the story. Okay, so yeah, I think for today it's everything. Next paragraph will be a little shorter, but nevertheless very very important. Okay, maybe I just had to stress now what the first reciprocal action was. I kind of forgot because I was so in there, but it's pretty clear, I think, now. We've stated it since from the very first sentence of this paragraph. So it's the idea that when you fight, there is always this fundamental swing between, you know, who is that gets the upper hand. You know, if you're fighting against someone, there is always you're fighting against a reacting force. So whatever you do against someone, it's something that someone is, you know, reacting to and reciprocating in a certain way. So it's responding. So this will be actually deepened better in other in another part of the Vom Krige that we will read relatively soon. And but it's very physical. You know, it's like a principle of dynamic. To every action corresponds an equal and counter reaction, fundamentally. Von Clausewitz has very clear in mind this kind of physical domain, because it's really a physical thing. Even if it involves the human psyche, that's really how things really work, because remember that war is an act of violence, and this act of violence entails physical force. So this is not simply something you can, you know, think about too cerebrally, too intellectually. These things get pretty material in real life. So there is obviously there are also psychological resources, not just physical ones, but nevertheless, it's as if you acted into a physical system. You intervene into a physical system, this system reacts in some way. So just always bear it in mind. Do not concentrate the mind on just one side. Just know that in war, if you want to understand something from it, you have to look at both sides. And in the reaction that these systems have, the one with the other. Otherwise it's useless. And naturally the difficulties in war arise from the fact that when you are fighting the war, you are either from one side or another, and you generally know much less about your opponent than your opponent does. So, and vice versa though. So that's where it gets difficulty, where it gets difficult, and why military history eventually is, you know, has this task of figuring out what this relation, these reciprocal actions really were about. Okay, so this is really all. Next time we will read the aim to disarm the enemy. Also very interesting. They're a bit all part of the same, you know, that here you realize how von Clausewitz has, from a definition, has already developed other considerations, how I would say articulated and branched fundamentally the system gets, and we're still at the very beginning. So you can imagine how complicated, I mean how complex at least, the system really is. Otherwise certain conceptions are kind of not really they're partly repeating each other, but they're also making you understand certain things from different points of view and in relation to other elements. Today we have, for instance, redefined the definition of war that is fundamentally equivalent, given what we have talked about on the utmost use of force. So you can use theoretically both, depending on what you want to focus on. So this is very important, because the system otherwise is very simple. And I would say that the most difficult thing is to get the simplest things first, and then to get into the rest, because once you get the essentials, you have a huge edge to understand the whole thing. And that's how you have to proceed with von Clausewitz. Okay, so for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.